They sold her as Barren. But what the rancher discovered will break every heart. It was a crisp morning in late autumn when Thomas Gallagher, a seasoned rancher, rode into town. The wind whistled through the canyon, carrying the scent of earth and grass. Thomas had seen many things in his 35 years: ranches toiling in drought, cattle being lost to predators, and men broken by the hardships of the land. But he'd never encountered a deal like the one that would change his life forever. The sun was barely rising as he made his way down the dirt road to the small trading post. He needed supplies: salt for his cattle, leather for saddles, and grain for the horses. But as he stepped down from his horse, he noticed a figure waiting by the fence. A woman, her face half hidden under the brim of her bonnet, standing alone in the shadow of the old barn. She wasn't just any woman. There was something about her that caught Thomas's attention. Her presence seemed to absorb the sunlight, as though she belonged to a different world, one that didn't quite fit with the everyday life of a rancher. As he walked past, he overheard snippets of a conversation, a harsh voice, a desperate tone, words like worthless and barren. Thomas paused, curiosity getting the better of him. He looked back toward the woman. The words echoed in his mind. Barren, what could that mean? The man speaking to the woman was older than Thomas, perhaps in his late 50s, with rough hands and a face as weathered as the dry land itself. His words were harsh, though there was an edge of desperation to them. "You're no good to me anymore," the man said, his voice low and cold. "She's as good as Barren, just like I said. No reason to keep her around." Thomas wasn't one to meddle in other people's affairs, but he felt a strange pull. The woman's face was still hidden, but he could see her hands tremble as she stood silently, listening to the words that were clearly meant to break her spirit. Before Thomas could decide whether to intervene, the conversation shifted. The man's voice grew louder as he addressed Thomas. "You looking for help, Gallagher?" he asked, his tone suddenly friendly. "I've got someone who could use a job. Hard worker, quiet, and won't complain about much. Could be just what you need." Thomas hesitated, his eyes still on the woman. There was something about her that seemed out of place in this harsh world. She wasn't just a worker. She was a person, a human being, with a story he couldn't quite figure out. He was a practical man. What he needed was a good hand for the ranch. But his heart told him there was more to the woman than what met the eye. He nodded slowly. "What's the deal?" The older man looked around, ensuring no one else could hear. "She's the daughter of a family up north. They say she's barren, can't have children. The family's tired of her. No use for her anymore. I'm just getting rid of her. If you want her, take her. Cheap." Thomas felt a sting of confusion, but he pushed it aside. He was no stranger to the hardships of the land and knew that people were sometimes forced to make hard decisions. Still, something about this seemed wrong. A woman sold off like livestock because of something as personal and painful as her ability or inability to have children. He glanced at her again. The woman's eyes were cast downward, her posture slumped as though she were carrying a weight too heavy for any human being to bear. Her hands were raw from work, and her clothes were simple and worn, but there was an elegance to her, something delicate beneath the surface. "I'll take her," Thomas said, more out of instinct than anything else. He wasn't sure why he said it, but something inside him told him it was the right thing to do. Maybe she could help with the chores. He wasn't expecting much. The ranch was a hard place, and everyone had their place in the world. As long as she worked hard, that was all that mattered. The older man nodded, clearly eager to get the transaction over with. "Good. You're doing me a favor. She's nothing more than dead weight anyway." As Thomas turned to lead the woman away, he finally got a better look at her. She was tall, though slightly hunched, as if she were trying to make herself smaller. Her face was pale with soft features, but there was a hardness in her eyes that spoke of sorrow and years of hardship. She didn't meet his gaze as he approached, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Come on," Thomas said gently, hoping to make her feel less like a stranger. "Let's get you settled at the ranch. It's not much, but it's home." She nodded without a word, and they walked together in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken thoughts. Thomas tried to think of something to say, some way to break the silence, but nothing came. It felt as though the woman was made of glass, fragile and distant, and any attempt to reach her would only shatter what little was left of her. As they made their way to the ranch, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than he could understand. He didn't know it yet, but this would be the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. The woman, who had been labeled Barren, was carrying secrets too painful for anyone to hear, and as Thomas took her into his home, the shadows of her past would slowly begin to creep into the light. The ranch was quiet, save for the rustling of the wind through the trees and the soft sounds of animals in the distance. Thomas Gallagher's ranch was large, with sprawling fields and acres of land that needed constant attention. There was always work to be done, and for as long as Thomas had been there, it had always been just him and a handful of workers. It was a lonely life, but a life he had grown accustomed to. Sarah's arrival didn't change the rhythm of the ranch immediately. At first, she kept to herself, sticking mostly to the chores that Thomas had assigned her. She worked hard, but there was a coldness to her actions. She never complained, but she never smiled either. It was as though her body was moving through the motions while her heart was far away, locked inside a place where no one could reach it. Thomas watched her from a distance. He had expected her to be a bit of a mystery, but he hadn't anticipated just how closed off she would be. Sarah hardly spoke, and when she did, it was only to give short, polite answers to his questions. She didn't seem interested in making friends, and she never seemed to have a moment's peace, always busy with one task or another. Despite the silence between them, Thomas noticed something in her that set her apart from the others. While the other workers would grumble about the long hours or complain when the weather turned cold, Sarah never uttered a word of discontent. Her movements were steady and practiced, as though she had learned to hide her feelings behind a mask of efficiency. It made Thomas wonder what had happened to her, what had shaped her into someone so guarded, someone who seemed so far removed from the world around her. As the weeks went on, Sarah settled into the routine of the ranch. She took care of the animals, helped with the harvest, and managed the small household chores. There was something graceful about her, despite the hard work and the stoic expression she wore. She had a way of moving that was almost ethereal, as though she belonged in a different world entirely, a world that wasn't tied to the harshness of ranch life. One afternoon, Thomas found himself working in the barn when Sarah appeared at the doorway. She had been out with the cattle all morning, and her face was covered in a fine layer of dust, her hair tangled and wild. But there was something about the way she stood there that made Thomas pause. She wasn't just tired, she was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. There was a sadness in her eyes, a deep, quiet sorrow that Thomas couldn't ignore. He had always been a man of few words, preferring the company of his cattle and the comfort of his own thoughts. But something about Sarah's silent suffering tugged at his heart. He knew she was hiding something, but what? And more importantly, why had she chosen to bury it so deeply? "Sarah," Thomas said, his voice soft and steady, "you don't have to keep everything inside." "If there's something bothering you," she shook her head quickly, cutting him off. "I'm fine," she said, her voice low and distant. She didn't meet his gaze. "Just tired. I'll get back to work." But Thomas could see it in the way her hands trembled as she spoke, the way her eyes darted away from him as though afraid to show any vulnerability. It was as though she was afraid to admit that she needed help, or worse, afraid that someone might care enough to offer it. For the next few days, Thomas noticed that Sarah seemed to retreat even further into herself. She worked harder than ever, but there was no light in her eyes. It was as if she had resigned herself to the life she had been given, as though she had long ago decided that nothing, no amount of kindness or sympathy, could ever change her circumstances. Thomas had heard the rumors when she first arrived, how she was sold because she was barren, how her family had cast her aside. But in his heart, Thomas didn't believe that. There had to be more to her story than what they had told him. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was carrying a weight far heavier than any work on the ranch, a burden that had broken her in ways he could barely begin to understand. He tried to reach out to her in small ways, offering her a bit of kindness here and there, giving her a moment of rest when he saw she was overworked. But it was always met with silence. She accepted the kindness without protest, but never returned it. There was a wall between them, one that Thomas couldn't climb, no matter how hard he tried. Still, Thomas couldn't give up. Something about Sarah's quiet strength, her resilience, spoke to him. He had seen people broken by life before, but Sarah was different. She didn't just carry her pain, she wore it like armor. It was as though she had built herself into something unbreakable, something that no one could ever truly understand. Over time, the ranch began to feel a little less empty. The silence between Thomas and Sarah, though still thick, became more comfortable. She didn't speak much, but her presence filled the space in ways that words could not. The sound of her moving about, the soft creak of the barn doors, the clink of tools, these became the soundtrack of Thomas's life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the orange glow filled the sky, Thomas found himself sitting on the porch, staring out at the endless fields that stretched before him. It had been a long day and his body was weary from the work, but his mind kept returning to Sarah. He thought about her quietly working beside him, her face a mask of concentration, and how she never seemed to ask for anything, not even a kind word. "Sarah," he called softly, his voice carrying on the evening breeze. She appeared from the shadows, her silhouette faint but distinct. "Yes, you can talk to me, you know," he said, trying to sound casual, but something in his voice betrayed the care he felt for her. "If you ever need someone to listen, I'm here." For the first time, Sarah paused. Her hands, which had been busy working the entire day, were still. She didn't respond immediately, but Thomas could see her thoughts swirling in her mind, even if she didn't say them aloud. She was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if searching for something, anything, to break the silence between them. "I know you don't owe me anything," Thomas added gently, his heart heavy. "But you don't have to carry everything alone." She took a deep breath, and for a moment, Thomas thought she might say something. But instead, she just nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to tell him that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as far away from the world as she had been before. With that, she turned and walked back toward the barn, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. It wasn't much of a conversation, but in that small exchange, Thomas saw something, a flicker of hope, a tiny crack in the wall Sarah had built around herself. It was a start. And for the first time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, Sarah wasn't as lost as she seemed. The days passed in a steady rhythm at the ranch, the world outside changing only subtly with the seasons. The harshness of winter was beginning to settle in, and the cold winds cut through the land, turning the landscape into a sea of barren trees and frost-covered earth. Thomas worked tirelessly, overseeing everything from the feeding of the cattle to the care of the horses. Yet, even as the work piled up, his thoughts often drifted back to Sarah. He knew there was something more to her, something deeper hidden behind the quiet facade she had built. He had seen the way her shoulders drooped in exhaustion, the way her hands trembled when no one was looking, and the way her eyes seemed to carry the weight of a past she couldn't escape. Thomas, a man of few words and even fewer questions, wasn't one to pry into someone's past. He believed in letting people live their lives in their own time, but as the weeks turned into months, his concern for Sarah grew. He couldn't help but feel that she was on the edge of something fragile, something painful, that she had never shared with anyone. One evening, When the cold wind howled through the cracks of the old barn, Thomas decided that he couldn't ignore his instincts any longer. He had to know the truth, even if it was something that might break his heart. It was after supper one chilly night that Thomas found himself walking towards the barn. The full moon cast long shadows across the yard, and the ranch was wrapped in a quiet stillness, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Sarah had been working tirelessly all day, just as she always did. She had fed the animals, checked the fences, and even helped him with repairs on the roof. But there was something different about her tonight. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she were carrying a weight too heavy to bear. He found her inside the barn, standing alone near the hayloft. She was staring at the floor, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face hidden in the shadows. The moonlight shone through the cracks in the wooden walls, illuminating her figure like a ghost from another time. "Sarah," Thomas called out softly. His voice was steady, but there was a concern in it that he couldn't hide. She didn't turn around at first, and for a moment he thought she hadn't heard him. But then, slowly, she lifted her head and met his gaze. There was a quiet sadness in her eyes, a depth of emotion that sent a chill down his spine. He had seen that look before in others, a look that said a person had been broken, not by the world around them, but by the world within them. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Thomas said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. I wanted to check on you." Sarah didn't respond. She just stood there, her hands still clenched, her body stiff. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind outside, howling like a distant wolf, and the rhythmic creak of the barn's wooden beams. "Sarah," Thomas said again, stepping closer to her. "You don't have to carry everything by yourself. I can't promise that I'll have the answers, but if you need to talk, I'm here." At this, Sarah finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "I don't need pity," she said, her words sharp but tinged with sadness. "I don't want anyone to feel sorry for me. I don't know how to let go." Thomas took another step forward, his heart aching for the woman who had suffered so much. He could see now that her pain ran deeper than anything he had imagined. She wasn't just weary from the long days of hard labor. She was carrying a sorrow so deep that it threatened to consume her. "Sarah, you don't have to keep carrying it," Thomas said gently. "Whatever it is, I can't help unless you let me, but you don't have to do this alone." For a long time, Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes lowered to the ground again, and her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. Thomas waited, not pushing, just standing there with her, offering what little comfort he could. Then, at last, she spoke again. But this time, her voice was different. It was softer, almost broken, as though the walls she had built around herself were beginning to crack. "I wasn't always like this," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to be full of hope. I used to think that life had something more to offer me, but then everything changed." Thomas didn't speak. He didn't want to interrupt her, not when it seemed as if she were finally starting to let go of the secrets she had been holding for so long. "I was married once," Sarah continued, her voice trembling now. "I thought he loved me. I thought I was enough for him. But after I lost the baby, everything changed. He told me it was my fault, that I was broken, and when my family found out, they abandoned me." Thomas felt his heart tighten as he listened. The pieces were falling into place. Sarah's pain, her silence, it all made sense now. The weight she had carried with her wasn't just from the work on the ranch. It was the weight of a love lost, of rejection, and of a family who had cast her aside because of something she couldn't control. "He said I was barren," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "That I couldn't give him a son, and so I was no good to him, no good to anyone, so they sold me. They sold me to you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Thomas felt a deep sense of anger rise within him. How could anyone treat another person this way? How could her family, the people who were supposed to love her, do something so cruel? "I'm so sorry," Thomas said softly, his voice filled with an emotion he didn't often express. No one deserves that. No one deserves to be made to feel like they're worthless because of something beyond their control. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she wiped away a tear, the first one Thomas had ever seen fall from her eyes. She wasn't the stoic woman she had been before. She was just a woman, broken and vulnerable, letting go of the years of pain she had buried inside. "I thought I was broken," she said, her voice shaking now. "I thought that because I couldn't give him a child I was nothing, but I never wanted to believe it. I never wanted to believe that I wasn't enough." Thomas stood there, watching her, his heart heavy with the weight of her story. He had known that Sarah carried a burden, but he hadn't realized just how deep it went. She hadn't been abandoned because of a flaw or because she was weak. She had been abandoned because of something cruel, a world that valued women only for their ability to bear children, a world that had cast her aside as if she were no more than a failed promise. "You're not broken," Thomas said, his voice firm now. "You're not what they said you were, you're more than that. You're stronger than they ever gave you credit for." For the first time, Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But how can you say that? How can you look at me and not see what I am?" Thomas took a step closer to her. "I see you," he said, his voice steady and kind. "I see a woman who has been through hell and come out the other side. I see a woman who's still standing, even when everything else has fallen apart. And I'm telling you, Sarah, you're not broken. You're just beginning to heal." Sarah didn't speak again. Instead, she just stood there, her chest rising and falling with quiet breaths, the weight of her past still pressing down on her but beginning to lift, just a little bit. It was a start. Part 4. The truth unveiled expanded. The weeks after that conversation in the barn seemed to stretch into an endless sea of quiet moments and unspoken understanding. Sarah had begun to change, slowly and imperceptibly. It wasn't that she had forgotten her pain, or that the shadows of her past had completely disappeared. But something had shifted, something inside her that made her feel just a little lighter, as though the weight she had carried for so long had lessened, even if just a little. Thomas noticed the change, though he never mentioned it. She still worked just as hard as she always had, but now there was a softness to her. She didn't seem so distant, and sometimes, when the sun was setting and the air was cool, Thomas would catch her staring out across the fields, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It was the first time he'd seen her express anything like peace, even if it was just for a moment. One evening, as the golden light of dusk poured over the ranch, Thomas found Sarah sitting on the porch. She was wrapped in an old woolen shawl, her feet resting on the top step, her hands loosely clasped around her knees. The air was cold, but she didn't seem to mind. There was a quiet strength in the way she held herself now, a subtle change that didn't escape Thomas's notice. For a moment, Thomas simply stood at the door, watching her. There were still so many questions left unanswered, about her past, about what had led her to this point. But for now, he was content to just be present, to let the silence between them speak louder than words. After a while, Sarah turned her head and saw him standing there. She didn't look surprised. It was as though she had known he was there the whole time. "Evening, Thomas," she said softly, her voice calm and steady but with an unmistakable warmth to it. "Evening," Thomas replied, stepping outside and sitting down beside her. There was no need for small talk. They had learned to communicate without words, to share space without the need to fill every silence. It was a rare kind of understanding, one that could only come from shared pain and the willingness to heal together. They sat in silence for a while, the night settling around them. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one in the clear sky above, and the ranch seemed peaceful as though it were holding its breath. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice quiet but certain. "About not being broken, about not being worthless." She paused, taking a slow breath. "I don't know if I believe it yet, but I think I want to try." Thomas turned his head to look at her, surprised by her words. For so long, Sarah had kept herself locked away, guarding her heart with an unbreakable resolve. But now, in the stillness of the night, she was beginning to open up. "I don't know how to stop feeling broken," she continued, her gaze distant as though she were speaking to herself more than to him. "I don't know how to forget what they did to me. The way they treated me like I was nothing, like I had no value because of something I couldn't control. It's hard to look past that, but when I look at you, Thomas, I see something different." Thomas felt a pang of emotion at her words. He didn't say anything, though, because he didn't need to. Sarah was speaking her truth, and that was enough for him. She was beginning to trust him, to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could let go of the past and start anew. "I've spent so long thinking that my life was over, that there was no way forward," she said, her voice quieter now, almost like a confession. "But being here with you, it feels different. It feels like maybe there's still a chance. Maybe there's still a part of me that hasn't completely given up." Thomas's heart swelled with emotion as he listened. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew that healing wasn't something that happened overnight. But he also knew that Sarah was stronger than she gave herself credit for. She had already survived so much, and now she was learning to see herself differently. "You're not broken," Thomas said gently, his voice firm but kind. "You're not what they said you were. You're something more. You're someone who's been through hell and kept going. That's not weakness, Sarah. That's strength." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She sat still, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Thomas could see the storm of emotions swirling within her, the confusion, the doubt, the fear. But there was something else there, too, something that had begun to grow over the past few weeks. Hope. "I've been afraid," she admitted finally, her voice soft. "Afraid that I wasn't worthy of anything, of love, of kindness, of a future. I thought that if I let myself feel too much, I would fall apart. But now, I don't know, maybe I'm ready to try. Maybe I can let myself believe that I'm worth something, even if it's just a little." Thomas smiled, his heart lifting at her words. It was a slow process, but Sarah was beginning to see herself in a new light. She was starting to believe that she wasn't defined by her past, that she could create her own future. And Thomas was more than willing to help her, to be there for her every step of the way. As they sat together in the growing darkness, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees filled the air. The stars above twinkled brightly, as though the universe itself was watching over them. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like maybe, just maybe, she could begin to heal. But even as hope began to grow inside her, Sarah still carried the remnants of her past. The scars from the life she had left behind were not so easily erased. The weight of her family's rejection, the pain of losing a child, the feeling of being discarded, they were all still with her, hovering just below the surface. Thomas knew this. He knew that healing wasn't a straight line, but he also knew that Sarah had begun to move forward, one small step at a time, and that in itself was a victory. "Thomas," Sarah said after a long pause, her voice barely audible, "I've never said this before, but thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance, for seeing me not as a broken thing, but as me." Thomas reached out and placed a hand on hers, the touch warm and steady. "You don't have to thank me, Sarah. You've always been more than enough. You just needed to see it for yourself." And for the first time in years, Sarah felt a spark of belief in herself, a flicker of something that could become something more. She wasn't healed yet, but maybe, just maybe, she was on her way. This expanded part shows Sarah's emotional breakthrough as she begins to open up to Thomas and herself. It portrays a delicate balance between healing and the lingering pain she still carries. The connection between Thomas and Sarah deepens, with both learning to trust in the possibility of a future beyond their pasts. Let me know if you'd like to proceed with the next part, or if you'd like any adjustments. The winter months passed slowly at the ranch. The cold winds cut through the land with a bitter sharpness, and the nights were long and still. But despite the harshness of the season, there was something different about the way Sarah and Thomas moved through their days now. Their bond had grown, stronger than either of them had anticipated. There were still moments of silence between them, but they no longer felt like barriers. They were simply pauses, moments of peace in a world that was often too loud. Thomas had always believed in the quiet strength of hard work, but as he worked beside Sarah, he began to realize that there was more to strength than just enduring the pain. Strength was also in choosing to heal, choosing to believe that there could be a future, even when the past had cast such a long shadow. Sarah had begun to heal in her own way, slowly letting go of the pain that had once defined her life. Yet despite the growing connection between them, there was still a lingering question in the air, one that neither of them had fully addressed. It was a question that had been there from the beginning, a question that neither Sarah nor Thomas knew how to answer. What would happen next? Could there ever be a future for them beyond the shared work on the ranch? Could they move forward together, despite the past that had shaped both of their lives in ways they couldn't easily forget? It was late one evening when Sarah finally broke the silence that had settled between them. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the small cabin the fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the room. Sarah sat by the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames, her fingers nervously twisting a piece of cloth in her lap. Thomas, who had been standing by the hearth preparing for another long night of work, glanced over at her. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. He turned to look at her, his brow furrowing slightly at the sound of her voice. Sarah had been quieter than usual that evening, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. He took a step closer, his heart skipping a beat. He knew something was coming, something important. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and reassuring, "what's on your mind?" She looked up at him, her eyes dark with emotion. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been thinking about what you said, the things you've said to me about not being broken, about not being worthless, and I think I've started to believe it in a way, but there's something else I need to say." Thomas waited, his heart pounding in his chest. The air between them seemed to thicken with the weight of her words. "I know I've started to heal," Sarah continued, her voice steadying as she spoke. "And I know that I've found something here, something that feels real for the first time in a long time. But there's something inside me that I can't ignore anymore. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it is. When I look at you, Thomas, I see someone who has given me a chance to be more than just what I've been labeled. You've given me a home, a place where I'm not just a burden. And I don't know how to handle it." Thomas could feel the tension in her words, the struggle she was facing as she tried to make sense of the feelings that had been building between them. He stepped closer, sitting down beside her by the fire. He didn't know where this was going, but he knew that he needed to listen. That was the one thing he had learned over the past months. Sometimes, silence was the most important thing he could offer. "I don't want to hurt you," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't want to be the reason your life is harder than it has to be. You've given me so much already. I don't want to ask for more." Thomas reached out, gently taking her hand in his. He had never been good with words, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let her carry this burden alone. He couldn't let her think that she wasn't worthy of love, that she didn't deserve a future beyond the pain she had lived through. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice steady, "you've never been a burden. You've never been anything less than someone I admire. You've worked harder than anyone I've ever known, and you've carried a weight that no one should ever have to carry. But you're not alone anymore." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for something, perhaps for reassurance, perhaps for understanding. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between the woman who was still haunted by the past and the woman who was trying to step into something brighter, something better. "I've always thought I didn't deserve anything," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always thought I was broken, that I couldn't give anyone anything because I had nothing to give. But now I don't know. I don't know if I can move forward. I don't know if I can take that step." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to know right now. You don't have to have all the answers. We're here together, and that's enough for now." But even as he spoke those words, Thomas knew that the decision was ultimately hers to make. He couldn't force her to stay, couldn't make her believe in something she wasn't ready for. All he could do was offer her the truth of his heart, the truth that she had a place here with him as long as she wanted it. Sarah was silent for a long time, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames of the fire. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy, as though the weight of the moment was pressing down on them both. Thomas didn't rush her. He knew that some decisions couldn't be made quickly, that some things had to be felt deeply before they could be understood. Finally, Sarah looked up at him, her eyes full of emotion. "I don't know what the future holds, Thomas. I don't know if I can ever be the woman you deserve, but I can't keep running from it. I can't keep hiding from what I feel." Thomas felt his chest tighten, his heart beating faster as he realized what she was saying. She wasn't rejecting him. She wasn't pushing him away. She was simply acknowledging the fear that had kept her from fully embracing the future they could have together. And for the first time, Thomas understood that it wasn't the past that defined them. It was the choice to keep moving forward together. "I don't need you to be perfect, Sarah," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just need you to be you, and that's enough." She took a deep breath, her eyes searching his for any sign of doubt, but there was none. Thomas's heart was open to her, and he wasn't going anywhere. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted, her voice small. "I'm scared that I'll mess this up. I'm scared that I'll never be good enough." "You are more than enough," Thomas said, his voice firm but kind. "You've always been enough." And in that moment, Sarah felt something inside her shift. It wasn't a grand revelation, but a quiet acceptance, a softening of the walls she had built around her heart. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more. She allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a future that wasn't defined by the mistakes of her past. "I'm ready to try," Sarah whispered, her eyes meeting his. "I'm ready to see what could be." And as the fire crackled in the hearth, Thomas pulled her into a gentle embrace, the warmth of the moment wrapping around them both. There were still many challenges ahead. There would be days of doubt, of fear, of old scars that threatened to resurface. But in that moment, with the fire casting its glow on their faces, they both knew that they had taken the first step toward healing together. The past would always be a part of them, but it would no longer define them. They had both been through their share of heartbreak, but now they were ready to face whatever the future held, together.